Hello, everyone, and welcome to the October 2020 Legacies and Lunch, a program of the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. Had to fix my mute on my YouTube or y'all were going to hear me in double. Sorry about that. Okay, so here we go once again. I'm Heather Register Zabindin, Outreach Coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library is located in downtown Little Rock across Rock Street from the main library and houses the galleries at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. So we have some big news. We have new hours for the galleries at Library Square and the Roberts Library Research Room. The galleries at Library Square are now open Wednesdays and Fridays from 10 until 5 and Saturdays from noon until 5. You don't need an appointment. You can come in and browse the exhibits, shop, buy Christmas presents. It's never too early. And then the Roberts Library Research Room is open Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 10 until 5. But please call 501 320-5700 to make an appointment and request your materials at least 2 business days in advance. For all the specifics, go to robertslibrary.org to plan your visit. And for details about other COWS branches, which are all open now, please go to cows.org or call the specific branch. We will continue doing lots of virtual programming for the foreseeable future. You can find most of these programs archived at COWS YouTube channel. We've done a lot since March, since the pandemic started. So go to youtube.com and search for Central Arkansas Library System. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to fill your feed with interesting, fun, and educational content. One of the things that the Roberts Library has been doing during the pandemic is collecting stories, photographs, and art related to the COVID-19 experience of Arkansans. We did a similar collecting initiative last year during the Arkansas River flood. So go to robertslibrary.org for more information or to submit your photographs, art, and stories. We want to hear from you. Your history is important. The speaker will answer questions at the end of the session. Please type your questions in the chat box in Zoom and we will discuss them. So now for today's program. This year, 2020, marks the 50th anniversary of the publication of Dee Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. For me, as a high school junior, this was required reading, and that single assignment contributed more than I will ever realize to my chosen profession as a public historian. The Central Arkansas Library System and the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art are celebrating the anniversary of this American classic with a series of lectures and exhibits that recognize the enduring importance and power of Brown's groundbreaking volume. This program was made possible in part by a grant from the Division of Arkansas Heritage, funded by the 1/8 cent conservation sales tax, Amendment 75. For more details about our celebration events, please go to cows.org. I want to begin today's program with an acknowledgement of the Native peoples who have stewarded this land through the generations. I would like to acknowledge that this program is being held on the traditional lands of the Quapaw, Osage, and Caddo people, and pay my respect to elders both past and present. So thank you again for joining us today for Legacies and Lunch, now in its 21st year. Today we have a true legacy. Nicolas Proctor grew up in Little Rock and spent a great deal of time with his grandparents, Dee and Sally Brown. He has said, quote, "Growing up with my grandfather, I learned that history is both useful and interesting. I also learned that despite these qualities, most people are not interested in learning more about it. This led to a third insight. It needs to be accessible. If it's not presented in an engaging way, no one is going to learn from it. These insights have continued to shape my career as a historian," end quote. He is a professor of history at Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, and serves as chair of the editorial board of Reacting to the Past, a series of immersive historical role-playing games. So I want everybody to give Nicolas Proctor a very warm virtual welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
So thank you for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I will try really hard not to embarrass members of my family who are undoubtedly out there, as well as other people who knew Dee and Sally. So I will try to represent. In this, I think in your introduction, which was very nice, you mentioned that I'm a history professor now. I tried really hard to not be one. I really resisted going down the path of becoming a historian. I think as an undergraduate, I went through about 5 or 6 different undergraduate majors. But this was a thing that I was drawn back to again and again. And I think that it was largely because of the experience that I have with my grandparents. So in terms of the first thing, and the first theme I'd like to pick up, which is the idea that history is useful. I had easy access to really good stories when I was growing up. Both of my grandparents lived fascinating and rich lives. And I really needed to know some history to understand what they were talking about. So one little story was they talked about talking their way into the building in New York so that they could see Diego Rivera's murals after they were covered up by the angry industrialist who had paid for them, because they espoused the working class rising up and getting rid of people like him. This sort of, like, when you're 12 is a pretty interesting story. It's like, oh, my grandparents are sneaking in somewhere. But who's Diego Rivera? And who are the Rockefeller family, and why does everybody in the room other than me seem to know who they are? So that meant that history was useful for me in the sense that it gave me a sense of what the hell was going on, because people were constantly telling these stories about the past that I didn't really understand. I was an only child, so that it was generally an adult world that I was occupying. And when my grandfather would tell the story about the time that he was blown off by Betty Friedan, and people thought that this was hilarious, I needed to know who Betty Friedan was, and what it was about her blowing off him that made that story particularly rich. So for this, I think that one of the nice things that my grandfather did that I really wish every grandparent did, was he took some of the best of these stories and put them together in his book, When the Century Was Young, which of all of his books, for me, is really my favorite one, because he tested all these stories out on different audiences, including me, and burnished them. So it's like having a handy bound and typeset version of your family lore, which is good. So moving from history is useful, where I needed to understand some history to understand what people were talking about, that sort of moved into the history is interesting phase. Which was, the more that I learned about history, I read a lot of science fiction when I was a kid, and I started reading more and more history, because it was literally, the motto is true, stranger than fiction. Things that happened in the past were astounding in their oddness, but you could drill down into them and come to understand why they were happening. or why they happened. But again, sort of at at a young age, kind of imagine the first time that you find out about something like Pearl Harbor, and you're like, what? And then when you've got grandparents like mine available who had lived through those years, being able to then sort of pivot and go like, and they would tell you about their experience surrounding the beginning of World War II. So in terms of interesting, I really found that the history that I was discovering to be fascinating. Good teachers in high school. I had certainly history-minded grandparents, and I came to find that it was not only interesting, but that I really could not understand the world that I lived in without it. I find the world to be pretty interesting, so I found history to be pretty interesting. And some things about the world that I was growing up in, like racism, were just so utterly baffling. Sort of like, who came up with this? That it was really only in reading history that I started to begin to be able to make heads or tails out of it. The thing, though, that in terms of shaping me, maybe more directly as a historian, that my grandfather and I had a series of good conversations with, and sort of it was a kind of a theme going along, is that I had easy access to history. Sort of, I could be there at the table in the kitchen and ask a question whenever I wanted, and they would take the time to answer it. But most people don't have that option. I mean, most people have older relatives that have pretty fascinating stories. Most people don't have older relatives who were in Washington, D.C. during World War II, and that sort of thing. So my grandparents gave me some special insights that I think are difficult to get. So really the way that most people get their history is through watching good documentaries and by reading good books. I'm a print guy, so I really like the books better than documentaries. I think that this may be a thing that I got from my grandfather. He was definitely a print guy. That his first sort of real job was as a printer's assistant. So he was enamored of type. This is why I mean, I think I'm really happy that CALS is doing this, because libraries, I think, were my grandfather's favorite institution in the world. And if you pushed him, probably he'd say the only good thing that the government had ever done was to have libraries. He really fundamentally saw libraries as emancipatory because of the ability of people to access information through libraries for free that they don't have otherwise. So the fact that he had a library named after him was a great honor. That's sort of the best thing that could have been named after him. But if there's a book on the shelf there and it's just written in an unengaging way, it's not going to do much good. So I think in this, this is one of the great aspects of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is the book that he's the best known for. Is it's long. I mean, you cranked through this thing as an 11th grader. I'm impressed. It's an easy read in terms of the prose. It's an excruciating read in terms of the content. So I think that his ability to make this history accessible, and accessible from a different point of view that certainly in 1970, most of his readers were coming from when they were reading it, is really one of his greatest achievements as a historian. I mean, he did great archival work. He was a librarian, so this came naturally. Like he liked to say, librarians know where the sources actually are, and sort of pitied historians like me that we weren't actually in there thumbing through the closed stacks ourselves. But you know, I think that most good scholars can assemble the information. But I think the thing that was really the most successful about Bury My Heart for him was his ability to convey the information and to make it accessible. I'm not as good a writer as he was. I'm getting there. I still can't write dialogue worth a darn, but I'm moving along. I think that I really started my work with Reacting to the Past, which is as you said in the setup, it's an immersive historical role-playing game series. This is the primary way that I'm trying to make history accessible, is to move it off the page and into the classroom with people actually embodying historical viewpoints. I think it's pretty successful. You know, I'll admit that part of the reason why I do it is I don't know that I can write well enough to have that all just happen inside people's heads. But I think that he was able, and that really good writers are able. So you said maybe I should talk for 20 minutes. I think I've talked for like 10. But the Q&A is usually the most interesting part of things like this. I'm happy to talk more about any of that or anything else that people are wondering about.
No, that was perfect. That really was. So I do have some questions before we get into some questions from the chat. You know, the book you were talking about, When the Century Was Young. I mean, it is great that your grandfather did that. You know, not just to have it published, but to have that record. And one of the things we're working on is getting people to do oral histories, especially right now during the pandemic, when everybody's home and you can do, you know, you could do an oral history like this, like via Zoom. Did you record any interview? Did you sit down and talk to your grandfather and record any interviews with him, or?
No, I mean, I talked with him endlessly, but
Right.
but I didn't actually try to record any of them. It just would have sort of put a kind of an artificiality into the conversation.
Mhm.
I did actually record some of my grandmother's stories with a little tape recorder, but those, when I listen back to them, I mean there's a kind of a staginess to them. It's not inauthenticity, but it's not the way that the story would sound unstaged like that.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, and certainly I think that when people are doing oral history projects, there are all kinds of protocols and ways that professional oral historians get beyond that. I think that given that most people are not trained oral historians, and given that the people that you'd be talking to are members of your family, so we don't need to sign a release form to spy on members of our family. I just get them talking and then secretly record them.
Yes. Yeah, put the audio or the recorder. I mean, now it'd be a phone, right?
Just
But
put
put
the
it on
phone in your pocket, hit record, and start talking. And then you'll have to edit it down later on. But I think that you're going to get, in terms of a family story, a much better version of it if you do it that way, as opposed to a set piece.
Yeah.
Tell me the story about the CCC. It's just not going to be as good.
Well, and like you said, so you're an only child, I'm an only child. And so I did, like you mentioned, I spent a lot of time in an adult world. I mean, when we would go and visit my grandmother or my grandparents, we often sat in the living room and everybody talked about, it started out with who all had died lately, usually, but they talked about these kind of stories and I wanted to hear more of it. My cousins had no interest in it whatsoever, but I was always fascinated by that. Do you remember the first time you realized who your grandfather really was? I mean, he was your grandfather, but he was also Dee Brown, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, author.
No. I mean, because it was sort of just present.
Okay.
So I don't know, there was a period, I don't remember, it was a sort of early 80s, I guess, which was the first push to try to get Bury My Heart turned into some kind of film or miniseries.
Mm-hmm.
So there were all these phone calls, and all this correspondence and all this talking around the table about it, that sort of thing. It all came to nothing. So it was a big waste of time. My grandmother referred to it as the Bury My Heart in Hollywood period, because it, like the energy that he put into that, he could have written another book.
Yeah.
So it was just this kind of futile effort. So I think that because I was pretty quick on my feet, I was usually the person that was answering the phone in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that like Hollywood producers were calling him, I guess I was kind of like, well, that's unusual.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think that there was a realization. So in that, I mean, you asked me earlier on when we were setting this up, sort of the degree to which him being my grandfather is part of my public persona, which it isn't really.
Mm-hmm.
I did not try to avoid people finding out that I'm related to him, but I don't lead with it. And probably most of the people who know me don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that part of that kind of goes back to, I mean, the relationship that we had, the fact that he was a famous author didn't really come into it in a significant way in terms of mediating our relationship. I mean, it did in the sense that when I did my junior year abroad, I didn't need to worry about who was going to pay for my plane ticket, because he paid for my plane ticket. But it in terms of other things, it wasn't really there. So I kind of have continued being that way.
Yeah, I met your grandfather a number of times. I think we talked about this before. I worked at Wordsworth Bookstore, and so he and Charles Portis would come in together.
Yeah.
And so, here are two greats of the 20th century literary scene, and you would never know. I mean, if you didn't know who they were, you wouldn't know that they just were very humble and came in and looked around and had lunch. And so it was not, it was kind of a normal every Tuesday thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the things. Okay, the thing I think that maybe I did realize later, after knowing my grandfather and Portis, and Jack Butler, who is another Little Rock author, who is friends with them. I think that my kind of insight epiphany moment was actually going like, oh, other authors aren't like that. They can kind of be jerks, sort of like, oh, so you're going to walk around New York City in a white linen suit, and kind of like having this affected middle Atlantic accent because you're a famous author. Oh, that's a thing you can do. So I think that I sort of thought that everybody was going to be kind of like Harper Lee, and just kind of mind their own business and write their books, as opposed to doing some kind of showboat Norman Mailer kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So that was my realization, more than he's an author, is that there are lots of other authors, and most of them are nowhere near as humble and workmanlike as the one I'm related to and the other ones I know.
Yeah. Let's take some questions from the chat.
I'll just say sort of like, in turn, you mentioned Portis and coming into Wordsworth. So Wordsworth, of course, should have a plaque for its historical significance. The other place that you wouldn't think is Browning's Cafe in the Heights, which was where Portis always wanted to go to lunch.
Yes.
They still let him smoke. But it is pretty cool going out to lunch with two great literary figures, and tucking into some Browning's tamales. There's a kind of a weird, it is not Tavern on the Green.
No.
It is a different scene.
Yeah.
But having been to some of the sort of big New York City literary sites, I really like Browning's better at the end of the day.
And Faded Rose would fit in there too.
Yeah.
So yeah.
For Portis more than my grandfather. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, no, there's that is, Browning's is that place that people went to, and to know that they went there was, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
So Mark Chris wants to know, as a historian, what is your assessment of Burying My Heart at Wounded Knee?
Well, I mean, I think going back to some of the stuff that I said earlier, I think that it has an impact on American public opinion in terms of the history of the West and the history of American Indians. That's pretty significant. I think that the book remains a really good, compelling read. I think that in terms of some of the more recent books that have been written about the American West and the Indian Wars and the period that followed the Indian Wars, the early 20th century, and the history of different peoples then, I think that those more recent histories include information that Bury My Heart doesn't. I think that Bury My Heart probably remains the place that's the best place to start if you're interested in the history of Indians in the West and the relationship with the US government. I don't think I'd stop with Bury My Heart, but I also don't think that I would go straight to the most recent scholarship without going through Bury My Heart.
Well, and I think what I always forget, and I always have to remind myself, is that Bury My Heart was not his first book. And there were, and those earlier books, I mean, there's a trend of the American West and the Indian history, so he was ramping up in a way, I feel like, to Bury My Heart. And I think you're exactly right. You have to start there because we had to start somewhere. As a country, we had to look at that history differently than we ever had before. And I think that's what was such a big deal for me. The other choice, we had two choices in junior AP history, American history, for that period. And the other one was it was a military history about Custer and something about Morning Star. I don't even remember. I do remember
Morning Star?
Yes. It was white and very military looking, the cover. I do remember that. And I picked Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee just because I initially didn't want to read military history. And we had just finished Miracle at Philadelphia, which is an intense book as well. So,
right.
It was, but yeah, I think you have to start there, and it's approachable history. It's, he wrote it in a readable way. There's a lot of information there, but it's readable. And I think a lot of historians don't necessarily write that way, even still.
Yeah, well, I'd say, I mean, parts of it, to my eye, and I have grown up with the book, are not only readable but are poetic, which is a much older kind of history than we're used to, and certainly that I, as an academic historian, am used to. Academic histories are not poetic. So I think that these were really conscious decisions on his part when he shaped the book. And he didn't really like academic history. He he didn't try to talk me out of becoming an academic historian, but he was sort of like, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And certainly my first book, which he read, and Portis read a chapter of it for me because I wanted to make sure I got my gun stuff right, and I figured that he could do that. I was really apologetic to both of them in asking them to read it because I was like, it's interesting, but it's not engaging like the stuff that you all write. So I think that I think that there's a function for dry academic history, but that function does not include engaging a mass audience, and I think that Bury My Heart did that.
Yeah. So we have a question. Well, you may have really already answered this one, but we'll go for it anyway. So David Strickland thinks that Bury My Heart is one of the 10 most important books written by an American in the 20th century. And how do you think it's holding up? And I think like I said, you've probably answered that.
Yeah, I think that and it's another thing that sort of like when you live at ground zero, it's hard to be able to accurately assess what the blast wave is like. But certainly, and I appreciate Mr. Strickland typing that. This is a thing that I've heard from lots of people, from lots of different ethnic backgrounds. So I think that the impact of Bury My Heart, there are a lot of people that it was a kind of a life-changing book for. So I think that is a measure that not that many published titles can actually line up with. So yeah, I can't assess whether it's one of the top 10, but certainly I think for a lot of people, it most definitely is.
As part of the ramp up to this celebration and all of the stuff, I've read lots of articles, mainly journalistic type stuff, but everybody says when they came out, people assumed that he was Native American or American Indian. And I think that speaks highly of, and the fact that the American Indian movement really, attached themselves to it and appreciated it. I mean, I think that's huge. When you can, it's kind of like when men can write female characters very well, or females can write male characters very well. I mean, the fact that people thought that he had Native American background is really a testament to it.
I think that some people still do.
Yeah, no, yeah.
There are also, just because of his first name, there are some people that assume that he's an American Indian woman, which is interesting.
That is interesting.
Not a lot more, but that's a subset of people that kind of make some assumptions about his identity based upon his name and
yeah. And it's dedicated to you, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's my family nickname.
Okay.
Is Nicholas Bravewolf.
Yeah.
So I think, there are maybe 5 people left in the world that call me that.
Yeah. So
actually, one of my friends from college still calls me that. So 6.
It's kind of how well do they know you, whether they can call you by that. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Those kind of nicknames, you can tell how long you've known somebody. Yeah. So Cody,
but fortunately, nobody's left that calls me Sugar Boy, which was one of my other family nicknames. I'll take Brave Wolf. Sugar Boy is a little embarrassing.
Yeah. Well, now we've got it recorded on video, and it'll be on YouTube for the rest of time.
That's great.
Hopefully none of your
eternity
students
will enshrine.
Yeah. So Cody is asking, what did you think of the movie Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee?
Yeah, well, the movie was interesting, because they took the history. And then they did, as people often do for a historical film, they said, well, we don't want to make a documentary, but that history is sweeping and involves hundreds of thousands of people. So we're going to have difficulty finding scale. So let's stick a love story in the middle of it. You know, people like love stories, and it gives you some characters that you can follow. So I understand in terms of Hollywood screen logic why they did that. But in terms of it being a film version of the book, you know, it's not. Yeah. And it is a film about that is set in the period that part of the book is. You know, so there's a kind of a Venn diagram of overlap where it's like, yeah, the Sioux Wars, but their determination to cram a love story into it, I think really turned it into something totally different. So at the end of the day, what HBO really bought was the name. And they didn't really get the sweep of it. I mean, that, and even around the events that they chose to depict, they really cherry picked them in some odd ways in terms of the stuff that they decided to keep and not keep. One of the things that this did is it ended up meaning that they put some ahistorical elements into it. You know, in an effort to make the story work, they made some people, they put some people in places where they weren't historically, and that kind of thing. The screenwriter and I had a short conversation about this, a short and very awkward conversation about this. He, you know, his argument, it goes back to one of my points in my opening remarks, is he really felt like sticking the love story in it was important to make it accessible for people wanting to watch a movie, that they needed to kind of have this as this dramatic device as a handhold to pull themselves into it. And I think that if you're trying to build something with a 3-act structure, that probably makes sense. I think that if you're trying to do justice to what happened, probably not so much. Yeah. So, yeah. HBO, sort of as a corporation, was very nice about this. My uncle went to go see the premiere in California, and they flew my mom and I to Washington, D.C. to see the premiere. It was at the American Indian Museum in the Smithsonian, so that was pretty awesome. You know, but I, having watched the movie, do not feel compelled to watch it again.
Yeah. Once was enough.
Once was enough, yeah. And I got to stay in a 5 seasons hotel, 4 seasons hotel, however many seasons the expensive one is. And I don't expect I would do that under ordinary circumstances. I foolishly failed to take one of the bathrobes with me. But it was an interesting experience.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that this is, I've thought about it a lot, sort of like, what would Dee think about that thing? I think that his hope would be that if somebody watches the movie and gets something out of it, then maybe they'll read the book. And if they read the book, maybe they'll find out some things that they didn't know otherwise, and maybe that will lead them on to do other things or to read other things. So I think that HBO movie is a nice baited hook to sort of put in the water, you know, but it's just a hook with a worm on it called a love story.
I've always felt that historical fiction know, the dramatizations, Little House on the Prairie is a really good example. If it got people to go and investigate further into the real history, then it's accomplished something that sometimes the drier history, scholarly history can't do. So I think I'd agree with him on that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel not dissimilarly about something like Saving Private Ryan, which is pretty historically accurate for the first 20 minutes, and then it's not, like, at all. You know, but if that means that somebody's going to read Faces of Battle or some good history about the Normandy campaign, then that's probably a win.
Yeah.
So I don't hold historical films to the same kind of standard that I hold published history, simply because the objectives of the medium are different.
Yeah. Cody would also like to know, have you visited the Sequoia National Research Center at Ualr? It's the newspapers, the Native American. Yeah.
Oh, you know, I haven't. But I would like to. I use a lot of newspapers in my own research, but they're mainly newspapers from the American South. Yeah, oh wait, let me just do a show and tell right quick.
Okay.
Okay, so this is one of the favorite things that I have in my office, because my grandfather's day job was as a reference librarian, right? He was the head agricultural librarian at University of Illinois. So one day he was coming to work, and when he came into work, he would come in through the loading dock. And on the loading dock, he saw these pallets, these books on them. And he was like, what do you got there? What do you got on the pallet? And the guy working in the loading dock said, oh yeah, that's the bound New York Times. We've got the bound New York Times. And he said, well, why are they on the loading dock? And the guy said, well, they've all been put onto microfilm now. So we don't need the print copies anymore. And he said, well, what's going to happen to the print copies? He said, well, we're taking them to the dump. So my grandfather was like, if I drive my car around here, can I fill up the trunk with those? It was like, yeah, you know, that's like work I don't have to do. So he just grabbed the Civil War years. So I've got in my office, it's like a 15-volume run, and it's like, it's the New York Times.
Wow.
It's that you can feel that, like, I wish I could push this through the screen. You can feel the page and you can feel the impression of the metal type on the paper, if for people that have dealt with these before. So I have these, I use them sometimes for research, more often to try to impress people that visit my office. But sometimes for my Civil War class, I think more than anything, it's like this monument to the folly of man, because all those microfilm reels that they filmed it onto back in 1970, whatever, the plastic is all degraded now and they'll fall apart if you put them in a microfilm reader. So that was a long way of saying I really like old newspapers. So I'm not just making that up about going to the Sequoia Center. I think it sounds really cool. So the next time I'm in Little Rock, I'll try to go. Yeah,
we'll definitely, and we can help get that set up too, because that's when we were talking on the setup for this about the art is at the same, they're two different collections, but they're the same location. So Glenn would like to know, asks for you to please describe some of the role-playing activities, and then we have a follow-up question about that from Allie as well. So
yeah, sure. So the series, I'm the chair of the editorial board for it, is called Reacting to the Past. At this point, there are about 30 titles that are published in the series. About 2/3 of them are published through W.W. Norton, and the other third are published through the Reacting Consortium Press. The ways that these work is, So this is one that I didn't write this one, but it's one of the latest ones in the series about Title IX and athletics. So the way that the Title IX game works is you do a couple of setup sessions. So you read the history of Title IX and you read some history of women's athletics in particular and the history of higher education and the role that athletics plays in that. Then everybody gets a roll sheet. So maybe you're a member of the House of Representatives, maybe you're the head coach for a big high-powered university, maybe you're a university president or something like that. And that role becomes your persona in the class, usually for the next couple of weeks, sometimes for 3 weeks. But I think a lot of people have done some kind of like mock trial or something like that. So they kind of have this, or model you in. So you have this familiarity with role playing in the classroom. Reacting is different in a couple ways. On the one hand, it's longer. So you're sort of in the perspective for a longer period of time. The thing that I think is good about this is it lets you really understand that perspective as a multifaceted thing rather than as just one thing. So you're the university president, you're trying to get a big gift for the college. But you've got other things going on too. So by inhabiting that role for a while, you begin to see that. The other thing that happens is most of the book are historical documents that are about the issue. So this I've found is the best way to get students actually closely reading historical documents and then recognizing that there are multiple ways to interpret them is when they're pitted against each other, making arguments where they have to draw upon the documents. So they're going to kind of go in and they're going to use, okay, when we look at the Title IX of the Education Act, this is what it actually says. And that means this. And then somebody in the back of the room is like, no, it doesn't. What it means is this. So then it always warms my heart that then other students are sort of looking in their books going like, well, what does it say? So the fact that the game takes place over the course of weeks and they're writing papers and they're giving speeches and they're doing backroom deals really helps to pull them into the period and the big ideas for the period. Plus, in some games, not so much Title IX, but in other ones, they get to like assassinate each other and blow stuff up, and students all like that.
Yeah. Yes, I could totally see my child enjoying that immensely. And I would enjoy it. I mean, I enjoyed my history classes in college and graduate school, but when you have that kind of, I guess, responsibility to your other classmates, it kind of changes the way you interact with each other.
Well, and it's fascinating, like I've done lots of student surveys on this, is one of the things, it's interesting that you use that word, is that the responsibility is actually one of the things that students say they get the most out of, is that you can't play the game passively. And for some people, just the fact that the games are usually win-lose things, I think this happens particularly for student athletes. They're like, well, I don't really care that much about history, but I'm going to win this thing. So they sort of, you get all of these intrinsic motivations that grades by themselves don't provide. And every game also, in addition to opponents, you have allies. So it's nice that you then have some people to work with. And it's always interesting when you find out that the person who was your ally on issues 1, 2, and 3, on issue 4, you're parting ways for some reason. And that also, I think, is part of the richness of it. So for example, one of the games that I wrote is about the secession crisis, and it's set in Kentucky, which is a slave state that stays in the Union. That in itself blows most students' minds because they're like, the what? But then when they get into the game and they're halfway into it and they realize that some of the people who want to stay in the Union are saying, we need to stay in the Union to defend our slaves. And some of the people who want to secede are saying, well, yeah, we should secede because that'll lead to the erosion of slavery. They're like, what seemed really, really simple is now really pretty complex. So that, that of course is the agenda of any professor, is to make things more complicated than they were coming in. And the games really do that well. Back to you saying you would have enjoyed this as a high school student. That of course is my not very well kept secret. I build these things because they're fun, and they're more fun to play than they are to run. But if I could have played these when I was a student, I would have been on just in heaven. I think there were though some secondary school teachers and some college teachers. I guess I'd particularly credit Ian King, who was one of my professors at Hendrix, who ran a congressional simulation in like an American government class. And the week and a half that ran, I was like,
you were present,
focused. And so remembering my experience, my limited experience with this kind of thing when I was a student, made me really convinced that it was a way to engage my students once I became.
Well, and the primary sources, when you do get into the primary sources, it is so much more complicated. Nothing is as easy. It's just not cut and dry like sometimes it's presented in history classes. So I'm always all for getting kids or students into primary sources and really looking at the material.
Yeah.
So
and the games give. Oh, sorry.
No. Go ahead.
Well, the games give them a reason. Mm-hmm. Otherwise it's sort of like, yeah, look at this and write a paper, and it's like, all right. But if it's like, look at this and then figure out how to get your roommate tried for treason, it's like, I'm there, and I'm going to do that. And knowing that your roommate is desperately reading the same stuff, trying to figure out how he's going to wiggle out of it.
Yeah. So Allie asks, do you think graphic novels or immersive video games or other kinds of modern technology are effective in getting young people interested in history?
Yes, in different ways. So I think that I think that sort of thinking about what the objectives and the strengths of the medium is going to be really important. I think that one game that I talk to my students about sometimes is Assassin's Creed. So for those of you all that don't know this, sort of predicated on there's the centuries-long conspiracy between these two secret societies, and they periodically assassinate each other in historically significant ways. So there's like one that's about ancient Greece, and one that's set during the French Revolution, and one that's set during the American Revolution. And the whole fantasy storyline that makes it go is like totally absurd Dan Brown kind of stuff. But especially the one where there's part of it that is in 1770s Boston, the programmers built historically accurate Boston. That like the buildings and the textures, they like researched what the paint colors actually would be, because in the colonial era we sort of think of the colonial era was like all white, but white paint actually really expensive. So like pumpkin is a popular color. They like did this. Then they even like worked with, and I forget what the technical name for it, but there's a subspecialty of historians that study past sound. Like, what did Boston sound like? So like, what would the sounds from the docks be? What would conversations in the street be about? But sort of like, who would be talking inside and who would be talking outside? And like, were there seagulls? And all this stuff. So they built the soundscape so what they discovered was that history teachers were basically playing the game in their classes, but weren't trying to achieve the objectives of their character. They were just like walking around on the rooftop with their daggers, but instead sort of going like, church, and there's and so the game publisher actually made a walkthrough mode for the game so that you can take your students on a virtual tour of Boston in 17th.
Very cool.
That's cool. That's going to engage some people. The problem with sort of just saying Assassin's Creed is going to engage people in history is they're sort of like, the Knight Templars are out there, and it's like, no, they're not. So
the Illuminati.
Right. So I think that's a case where that happens. Another video game that I play sometimes is called Hearts of Iron, and it's a big World War II simulator. It's insanely complicated. Don't play it, anybody. But you sort of like, you're making economic decisions and diplomatic decisions and military ones and technological ones and all of this stuff. So it's kind of legendary in its complexity. There's no Holocaust in it. Now, part of this is because the game makers were like, we don't want to make the Holocaust into a game.
Yes.
On the other hand, if you're going to understand economically what's happening in Germany and occupied Europe, and you don't include millions of people being murdered, your model is messed up.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of those places where it's a game that can teach you about a lot, but by virtue of the fact that it's a product that's built for entertainment, there's a lot that it's not going to teach you.
Yeah.
I think graphic novels, there are a few more graphic novel authors that are specifically writing for educational purposes, but a lot of the graphic novels that I've read that are designed to be educational have a term of the art is chocolate covered broccoli, where it's sort of like, look, kids, it's chocolate. And then you bite into it and you're like, you've tried to trick me. So the drama in them doesn't work very well. I mean, I think that probably most of the people on the call have heard of Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is a graphic novel that's about the Holocaust and a son talking to his father about his memories of the Holocaust. It's used in a lot of classrooms. I used it a couple of times, but I stopped because I realized what it really is it's really good graphic novel about father, his son, and the Holocaust. It's not a great way to understand the Holocaust because it's so singular in its focus. So I think that lots of graphic novels can be deployed well. I tend to use them more as primary sources and go like, okay, here's an edition of Wonder Woman from 1955. What's going on in this? And to have them assess it as a primary source rather than as a secondary source.
Well, that makes sense. Shirley has a question. So Shirley says, having done a little bit of living history, and I know Shirley, she's done more than just a little, portraying a historical person, but ad-libbing to a certain degree in presentations, I always worried about staying true to what can be proved from sources. How does this work in your role-playing games?
Yeah, well, the thing that's nice about the role-playing games is, at least for the in-class portions, I'm always still there, and everybody's also writing throughout it. So it gives me the opportunity to come in and correct a historical error. Mm-hmm. There are always a lot of minor historical errors, usually just because things are maybe a little anachronistic or something is explained in a way that's not really perfectly period. So I tend to let those go. Students actually identify most of those themselves. Mm-hmm. They're sort of like, Kim Kardashian's not alive, or something like that. But if it's a more major error, then I tend to let things play out and then send an email to everybody and say, well, actually that happened in 1850. or something like that. If it's really endangering the game, running off the tracks, and you can tell that everybody's thinking that that is what happened, then I'll just call a timeout. And I'll just be like, okay, I want to clarify this. You know, the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire are the same thing. And then everybody's like, oh, I thought so. You know, and then you could kind of go forward. So, but I try to not be overly interventionist. And 9 times out of 10, some other student comes in with the correction before I do. So because they're so engaged. So yeah, but I feel her pain. And I mean, I feel it when I'm teaching in class and I'm trying to explain something metaphorically or with a contemporary example. I'm always like, am I twisting the meaning of this somehow?
So I think this is your mom asking this question.
All right, I'm ready for my mom.
Didn't you have a student who became so involved in reacting that she cried?
I did more than once, but I think the one that I remember the most was a game that is about the independence and partition of India. You know, and the Indian partition is this horribly bloody, dislocating, you know, awful event. The student was a member of the INC, which was a party that was determined to keep India and Pakistan together. And then on the last session of the game, when the Muslim League marched heads held high out of the room to declare an independent Pakistan, a thing that she had been fighting against for the past 3 weeks. She just started to cry. Part of it was her own effort. It had not worked out. Part of it also, though, was we had talked enough about in the game book, had dealt with enough, like why this was going to be disastrous. But for her also, it was that the idea of a multi-party, multi-religion, multi-ethnic state was not working. So I think that there was a kind of a macro thing. You know, I think particularly as an American, this idea of, oh, wait, this particularism is dividing and tearing apart this diverse nation. What does that mean for me and the society that I live in?
Yeah.
Which I feel bad about, but at the same time, as an instructor, I feel like it's a big win.
Yes. Yeah. No, when they're that emotionally involved, yeah, you've definitely hit something much deeper. So
yeah,
that's really kind of cool.
Nobody's ever cried when I've given a lecture. I mean, I'm working on it, but yeah, it's very, very difficult to be as engaging.
Well, we're out of time. We're over time. This has been great. You know, you were right. The questions just kind of came and flowed, and this has been wonderful. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Like I've said, I think a million times, I really appreciate it because I felt like this was kind of the tying everything together of our celebration of your grandfather's book. So yes. So thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I just saw Kim Little's name pop up. She's working on a reacting game right now.
Yes, she said students really do ask to start class early. So
yeah, okay, I know we're out of time, but I just want to give this story because it'll blow your mind. This came from a colleague of mine named Paul Fessler, who teaches at Dordt College, which is a conservative Dutch Reformed school in Northwest Iowa. He was running a game about the French Revolution. And it was the first time he'd run it, and he realized he hadn't scheduled enough time for it. And the students realized this at about the same time. And they said, well, what are we going to do? We're not going to, how are we going to talk about issues X, Y, and Z? And he said, well, I guess we're only going to be able to talk about X and Y. And they were like, unacceptable. So they voted unanimously to start class 15 minutes early for the rest of the game so that they could deal with it. Okay, this is the thing. All right, so that's like that thing. It's Northwest Iowa. This was at the end of fall semester. So it's like early December in Northwest Iowa, and it's 8 a.m. class. And they're saying we would like to show up at 7:45. So yeah, I've not had that happen with one of my lectures either.
No, that's great. I mean, it is a great, I mean, I didn't know about it until I read your bio and looked it up. I mean, it's fascinating. Like I said, I would have enjoyed that immensely. Maybe, yeah. I don't think any of my former professors are on here, so that would have been fun. But yes, thank you so much, Nick, for doing this. We really appreciate it. Next, for everybody out there, next month, historian Michael Pierce is going to discuss the Nelson Hackett Project, a new website about a fugitive slave who fled Fayetteville, Arkansas, made it to Canada, and then became the only fugitive slave that Canada returned to bondage. So mark your calendar. Next month, Wednesday, November 4th at noon, will be virtual again. And please check out the other events that we've done around the 50th anniversary of Burying My Heart at Wounded Knee. In particular, now you can come in and see the exhibition of contemporary Native American ledger art from the J.W. Wiggins Native American Art Collection at UA Little Rock. So that's at the galleries at Library Square. So thank you again so much. This has been great. And we will talk soon.
Okay. Thanks very much, Heather. It was my pleasure. Thanks. And thank you, everybody who came.
Bye, everyone.